Mr. Chair, I call the honourable member Jami-Lee Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm happy to take a call in this debate. I have to say it's a little disappointing, Mr. Chair, to have this amendment in front of us from the Honourable John Boscawen. You see, Mr. Chair, the three strikes legislation is something that I'd say that, look, a good number of my constituents and a number of New Zealanders out there were happy to see being passed through this House because it dealt with the sentencing around serious violent offences. But you'd have to say that when you read the new provisions in the new Section 195, in Section 7, the new Section 195 to the Crimes Act that would be created by this bill, it just simply doesn't fit with the sentences, doesn't fit with the crimes that fall under Section 86A of the Sentencing Act. Mr. Chairman, let me just read out a number of those crimes. We've got sexual violation, we've got rape, we've got murder, manslaughter, wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, aggravated injury. Mr. Chair, those are all crimes that are acts of commission. Mr. Chairman, the new Section 195 is essentially, for the most part, an act of omission. It's a situation where an individual is not taking certain steps around children and vulnerable adults. Now, certainly, if the person was the one committing the child abuse, then absolutely that's terrible. Absolutely that's something that goes a step further along the lines of what the Honourable John Boscawen was talking about. But you'd have to say that there is quite a difference between being the child abuser and being the person standing back and doing nothing about the child abuser. This bill is saying that it's wrong to be the person standing back being the child abuser, but it is a lesser offence than actually being the child abuser. And that's quite a critical point, because the three strikes legislation was something that this government felt was important to pass, but there's a difference between being tough on crime and going too far. And Mr. Chairman, I'd say that the amendment that we have today just goes that step too far, because there's quite a difference between an act of commission and an act of omission. And Mr. Chairman, what we're talking about here in 195 is an act of omission. Mr. Chairman, on a wider note, I want to say how good it is that this legislation is being debated. And Jacinda Ardern made a comment earlier in the debate. She said the Labour government, the Labour Party, had unfinished business with this legislation. Well, Mr. Chairman, this was something the Labour government never did when they were in government, and it's taken a national government to come here and do this. Mr. Chairman, I hear Carmel Sepuloni, the woman who couldn't remember which reading we were on yesterday, didn't know which reading we were on yesterday, thought it was a first reading when it was actually a second reading that we're debating, who's claiming to be an expert on this. Well, Mr. Chairman, it took a national government to bring this to the House. We're doing this because we're a government about action. We're a government that says children are the most vulnerable members of society, and standing back and doing nothing about child abuse is not a good enough situation to be in, and those people should be punished as well. Mr. Chairman, I want to talk about a few other matters that haven't been covered yet in the debate today, and that's around the increased penalties for offensive weapons. Mr. Chairman, we haven't heard a lot about that, but that's another step that the government's taking in this bill, increasing the penalty from 2 years to 3 years, and would also be doubling the penalty for child abuse under this legislation as well. And those are some other matters that haven't been debated so far, but also need to be mentioned because they're important parts of this bill. The final part that I want to mention around this bill is the claim of right defence. And we heard Keith Locke talk about it earlier. I want to refer to a comment that Materia Ture made yesterday in the second reading debate. She said that the changes to the claim of right defence were an attack on civil rights.
Mr. Chairman.
I call the Honourable Minister Simon Powell.
Thank you, Mr.